The night the Alpha King rejected her, he didn't do it quietly. He did it in the Great Hall, under 1,000 torches, with every wolf in the kingdom pressing shoulder to shoulder just to watch. They packed the gallery above, leaned over carved stone railings with their eyes bright, and their chests full of something ugly, that particular human appetite that dresses itself up as justice, but is really just hunger for someone else's pain. She stood in the center of it all. No escort, no second. No one brave enough to walk beside her to that spot on the floor where the cold light pooled like spilled silver. Just her, and the weight of every eye in that room. She had walked this kind of silence before. Walked it down market aisles when she reached for bread and hands pulled away. Walked it through training fields when partners suddenly remembered somewhere else to be. She knew the particular quality of a silence that wasn't empty. The kind that was packed tight with everything people wanted to say but said with their bodies instead. With their turned backs and lifted chins and small, satisfied smiles. She knew what they saw when they looked at her. The bastard daughter of a man the pack still spat on. A traitor's blood running through her veins like a stain that soap couldn't touch. And worse, so much worse in their eyes, a mother who had reached past the laws of the moon and the pack and every sacred boundary they'd built their world on, and had touched something older, something darker, something that should have stayed sleeping. Forbidden magic. That was the polished way they said it. What they meant was, her mother had burned for it. And somehow, mysteriously, the daughter was still here, still breathing, still taking up space in a world that had decided long before she was old enough to understand that she did not belong in it. No one thought he would actually say it. That was the thing. They had come to watch her humiliated, to see the Alpha King look through her the way the rest of them did, to see the highest power in the land confirm what the lowest wolf already believed, that she was nothing, that the bond the moon had stitched between them was some cosmic error, some mistake to be quietly corrected and moved past. They had come for embarrassment. They had not come for rejection, because rejection was different. Rejection was official. Rejection meant standing before your mate in front of witnesses and cutting the thread the moon herself had tied, and saying out loud, "Into sacred air I do not want what was given to me." That was not a small thing. Even to the wolves who hated her, that was not a small thing. And yet, he stood at the far end of the hall on the raised stone platform, where the Alpha King always stood, where his father had stood, and his father's father before that. And he looked at her the way you look at something that landed on your sleeve, briefly, flatly, with the specific kind of cold that isn't anger, because anger would mean she mattered enough for it. This was dismissal, clean and total and absolute. His voice, when it came, was not loud. It didn't need to be. The hall was so silent she could hear the torches breathing. He said the words. And when he did, something inside her chest that she had spent her whole life pretending wasn't there, something fragile and stubborn and foolish, some small secret place where she had kept the idea that maybe the bond was real, that maybe the moon knew something the rest of them didn't, that thing broke. Not bent, not bruised. Broke. The sound the bond made when it snapped was something she felt in her teeth, in her spine, in the marrow of her. It was the sound of a door slamming on a room you've been locked out of your whole life, except somehow, impossibly, it still hurt. Even knowing you were never really welcome, it still hurt to hear the lock turn. Gasps tore through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Her wolf, that ancient, wild, wounded part of her she had never fully been able to tame, threw itself against the inside of her ribs and screamed. Not a sound. Something deeper than sound, a grief so old it had roots, and she stood there, in the cold silver light, in the center of 1,000 watching eyes, and she waited for the tears. Everyone was waiting for the tears. She could feel it, the collective breath-holding, the leaning forward, the anticipation sharp as a blade pressed soft against skin. They wanted her broken. They needed it. It would have made everything so tidy. It would have confirmed every story they had ever told about her, that she was fragile, that she was less, that she was exactly as small as they had always believed. But something moved in her instead, something that was not grief. Something slow and certain and terribly calm rose from a place inside her, she had never had a name for, and it spread through her chest, through her throat, through the muscles of her face, and she smiled. Not a shaking smile, not a sad, holding it together, trying to be brave kind of smile. A real one, the kind that didn't ask for permission. The torches nearest to her guttered all at once, in the same breath as if something invisible had exhaled. The shadows at the edges of the great hall, shadows that should have stayed exactly where stone and firelight put them, began to move, slowly. The way deep water moves when something large wakes beneath the surface. They leaned toward her. The crowd felt it before they understood it. Backs straightened. The pleased, hungry energy in the room curdled into something with a different taste. Something colder. Something that recognized, in the wordless animal way that predators recognize predators, that the creature standing in the center of the hall was not the thing they thought it was. She did not look at the Alpha King. She looked at the shadows. And the shadows, ancient, patient, waiting, looked back. No one was born into the Iron Veil pack the way Mara was. Most pups came into the world wanted, wrapped in the warmth of a mother's relief, a father's pride, a pack that pressed close and breathed them in and claimed them before they even had names. The pack bond was the first thing a wolf felt, that invisible thread connecting one heartbeat to hundreds, that low hum beneath the skin that said, "You are not alone, you are not alone, you are not alone." Mara had never felt it. Not once. Not even as an infant too young to understand why the women who brought food to the room where she slept always left a little too quickly. Not even as a child who watched other pups roughhouse and pile together after training and felt the specific loneliness of standing 3 feet outside a warmth that was never going to open and let her in. The pack bond existed for her the way sunlight existed for someone locked in a basement. She knew it was real. She could see evidence of it on every face around her. She just could not touch it, could not feel it reach back. She was 8 years old the first time someone said her father's name to her like a weapon. She was 10 the first time someone said her mother's word witch and spat after it like the word itself had left a taste. By the time she was 17, she had learned the particular art of making herself small without disappearing, of being useful enough to keep and invisible enough to be safe. She carried water. She scrubbed stone. She mended things that other wolves broke without thinking: equipment, linens, the little mechanical failures of a pack house that ran on the labor of people nobody looked at directly. She was good at it, not because she had no pride. She had plenty of pride. It lived in her like banked coals, not gone, not cold, just waiting for the moment it was safe to breathe again. But survival required patience, and Mara had learned patience the hard way. Had learned it in kitchens that went quiet when she walked in hallways where shoulders turned automatically, like flowers tracking away from the sun, in the dining hall where she ate standing, by the far wall, because sitting meant claiming a space, and claiming a space meant someone would find a reason to take it from her. She learned to need very little. She learned to want even less. And she learned this was the hardest lesson. The one that cost the most. She learned not to let them see it land. Not the comments muttered just loud enough. Not the foot deliberately placed in her path. Not the water she'd spent an hour hauling suddenly knocked sideways so it spilled across cold stone and she had to start again while laughter tracked her back to the well. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She went back to the well. This was the rhythm of her life. This was the full weight of it, not dramatic, not cinematic. Just the slow, grinding, ordinary cruelty of people who had decided long ago that she was beneath consequence, that what they did to her didn't really count. She was not a wolf to them. She was furniture that occasionally got in the way. And then one morning, a morning like any other, cold and gray with the particular flatness of early autumn, everything shifted. Not loudly. Not with fire, or thunder, or any of the signs the old stories promised when fate decided to move. Just a feeling, a prickling along the back of her neck, the kind that made the animal part of her go still without knowing why. She was crossing the inner courtyard of the pack house, a yoke across her shoulders, 2 heavy buckets pulling at each end. The water sloshed with every step. Her boots were wet through from the first trip. Her arms ached in that deep, familiar way that had long since stopped feeling like pain and just felt like mornings. She was not looking up. She rarely looked up, but something made her. She didn't understand it then, that pull, that sudden wordless instruction from the oldest part of her to lift her eyes. Later she would think about it, would turn it over quietly in the dark, the way you turn over a strange stone and wonder at what's underneath. But in the moment she simply obeyed it, the way animals obey the instinct that saves them without question, without thinking purely. She looked up, and found him already looking at her. He was on the upper walkway that ran along the second floor of the east wing stone railing. Iron torch brackets, the kind of architectural permanence that said power has lived here for generations. He was dressed plainly for a king. No ceremonial markings, no formal collar. Just dark clothing and that stillness that certain men carried. The stillness that wasn't relaxation but something closer to controlled force. The sense of something vast, held very deliberately in check. Alpha King Corvain. She had seen him before the way you see weather. From a distance. As a condition of the world she lived in rather than a person in it. She had never seen him see her, but he was seeing her now. His eyes were fixed on her with an attention so direct and so still that it stopped the breath in her chest for just a half second, not long enough to matter, not long enough for anyone watching to notice, but long enough for her to feel it. That look, heavy as a hand laid flat against a drum, silencing everything else. She looked away first. Of course she did. She shifted the yoke, adjusted her grip, and kept walking. Kept her spine straight, kept her face neutral. That was the discipline, the years of it, the 1,000 small rehearsals for this exact thing, keeping the inside separate from the outside, not letting one bleed into the other. But her heart was doing something it had no business doing. On the upper walkway, a voice broke the silence beside him. Low, easy, carrying the comfortable authority of someone who had stood at the side of power long enough to forget to be careful around it. His beta, Duran. Broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, the kind of loyal that ran all the way to the bone. Why are you staring at the servant? Not cruel, just honest. The question of a man who had learned to track his king's attention the way hunters track movement in long grass. Corvain didn't look away from the courtyard below. Didn't shift his weight, didn't change his breathing, didn't do any of the small, involuntary things that men do when they've been caught. He said it quietly, almost to himself. I don't know yet. Duran looked at him, then looked down at the courtyard, then looked back at his king with the careful expression of a man filing something away, not reacting, not questioning, just noting, storing, the way good betas always did, because their job was not to understand immediately but to remember later when understanding finally came. Corvain's eyes tracked her until the courtyard swallowed her around the corner. He stood there a moment longer than he needed to. There was something pulling at the edge of his awareness, not sharp, not clear, not the blinding flood of recognition the old stories described when a wolf found their mate. It was quieter than that, more like a sound just below hearing, a vibration in the bones rather than the ears, something the body registered before the mind had language for it. He didn't have a name for it yet, but his wolf did. His wolf had gone completely, utterly still the moment she'd looked up. And it was still now, not sleeping, not at ease, but arrested, suspended. The way a predator goes, still not out of calm, but out of the total concentration of every sense fixed on one single point. He had not felt his wolf do that in years. Not since the last war. Not since the last time something real was at stake. He turned away from the railing eventually, walked back to the business of being king. The meetings, the councils, the 1,000 small managements of power that filled his days from edge to edge. But something came with him. Something quiet. Something that sat in the corner of his chest for the rest of that day and said nothing, and left no fingerprints and refused entirely to leave. The royal ceremony of the blood moon convergence happened once every 7 years. It was the oldest ritual in Ironvale tradition, older than the pack house. Older than the bloodline that currently sat on the Alpha throne, old enough that the wolves who performed it no longer fully understood every piece of it. They did it because their parents had done it, because the bones of the tradition were load-bearing, and no one with any sense dismantled load-bearing bones. Every wolf in the pack attended. That was law, not custom. From the highest-ranked warrior to the lowest-ranked servant, every breathing member of Ironvale stood in that great hall and let the seer walk the lines of them and read the moon's will for the coming cycle. Mara stood at the back. Obviously, she had dressed carefully not to impress. There was no one here whose impression she wanted, but because dignity was the one thing no one could take from her without her permission, and she had decided years ago she was not giving anyone that permission. Her dress was plain and dark and clean. Her hair was pulled back with the kind of precision that said, "I know exactly what I am doing," without saying a word. She kept her eyes forward. She kept her breathing even. She was good at ceremonies, good at standing still inside the performance of normalcy while her insides ran a completely different current. She had attended 12 years of pack events in exactly this way, present in body, sealed off in every way that counted. And then the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the Alpha King walked in. Something happened to the air in the room when Corvain entered a space. It wasn't ceremony or theater, it was something older, something the pack felt in the animal part of themselves before the thinking part caught up. The room reorganized around him, not metaphorically, physically. Bodies angled toward him the way iron filings angle toward a magnet, subtle and involuntary and total. Mara felt it too. She had always felt it. That was nothing new. What was new was what happened next. He was halfway down the center aisle, flanked by his beta and 2 senior warriors, moving with that particular quality of stillness and motion that she had noticed in the courtyard weeks ago and had tried, fairly successfully, to stop thinking about when his eyes swept the room in the automatic assessment of a man who had spent his whole life reading spaces for threat, and landed on her. Everything in her chest went very quiet. His stride didn't break. His face didn't change. Whatever he was on the outside, composed, controlled, the immovable surface of a king that stayed exactly in place. But his eyes held. For just a breath, just one. And in that breath, her wolf, that ancient wounded creature who had been silent and hunched and careful for so long, who had learned to want nothing, because wanting led nowhere good, her wolf came awake. So suddenly it felt like a door being blown off its hinges. She pressed against the inside of Mara's ribs hard enough to hurt. And the word that came was not a question, not a hope, not the fragile, flinching wish of someone accustomed to being disappointed. It was a statement, flat and certain and absolute as gravity. Mine. Mara's breath caught. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum without thinking a physical response to a physical sensation, the bond flickering to life between them like a coal catching air, like something underground finally breaking the surface after years of blind upward pressure. No, she thought. No, no, no. Because she knew what this was. She had heard the stories, had absorbed them the way you absorb everything in a world that constantly reminds you of your place in it, with a specific, tired clarity. All the romance already scraped out of it. She knew what a mate bond was, knew what it meant. And she also knew with the cold precision of a woman who had spent her life doing the math on things that hurt exactly what happened when the moon made a mistake this large. The moon did not care about bloodlines, did not care about treason or forbidden magic, or the long memory of a pack that had decided her family name was synonymous with contamination. The moon had looked at her, and looked at the most powerful wolf in the kingdom, and had drawn a line between them with complete and total indifference to the catastrophe that line would cause. Across the hall, something moved in Corvain's face. Small, gone quickly. The kind of thing that would be invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to read the margins of expressions because the main text was never available to her. His jaw tightened, just once, and then the seer was at his side. Old Thessaly was not impressive to look at. Small, dry, wrapped in dark fabric, with the slightly unfocused eyes of someone who had spent so long looking at things other people couldn't see that ordinary sight had become secondary. She was the oldest wolf in Ironvale, possibly the oldest wolf alive. No one knew her exact age and no one asked, because there was a specific category of knowledge that felt more dangerous to have than not. She leaned close to Corvain. Her lips moved. Mara was too far away to hear it. Would never hear exactly what was said. would spend weeks afterward wondering, turning over possibilities the way you turn over stones, bracing for what might be underneath. Whatever it was, she watched it land on him. She watched him receive it the way a man receives something heavy, not staggering, because he was too controlled for that, but absorbing, taking the weight, redistributing it somewhere internal where it wouldn't show. His eyes came back to her, and this time what was in them was different. Not the arrested stillness of the courtyard, not the quiet, unnamed pull she had seen from the upper walkway. This was conflict. Real, visible, tearing conflict, the look of a man who has just been handed two truths that cannot both be honored, and knows it, and is already choosing. She felt the choice before he made it. Her wolf felt it too, and made a sound inside her that had no human translation. A sound of pure anticipatory grief, the grief of something that had just been found immediately before being lost. Corvain straightened, turned to face the hall. His voice, when it came, was the voice he used for decrees. Not the quiet, careful voice of the courtyard, not the voice she had heard from a distance, low and controlled. This was the full instrument of alpha authority resonant, final, the vocal equivalent of a door bolted from the inside. Mira Blackthorn. Her name in his mouth was the strangest thing she had ever felt. Even now, even like this, there was a frequency to it that moved through her separately from the sound itself, something the bond carried underneath the words, and she hated that she felt it, and she felt it anyway. Every head in the hall turned toward her, 1,000 faces finding her in the back of the room, 1,000 expressions cycling through the same short sequence, surprise, recognition, something mean and pleased settling in at the end like sediment finding the bottom. She walked forward, because what else was there to do? She walked forward through the parting crowd, through the silence that wasn't silence, through the weight of every eye, and she stopped where the cold light pooled on the stone floor, and she stood straight and she looked at him. His face gave her nothing. I reject you as my mate. The hall detonated. Not in fire. In sound, that collective exhale of shock that converts immediately to something uglier, to satisfaction, to the bright particular pleasure of a crowd that came for a spectacle and received one beyond expectation. Laughter moved through them in a wave. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to fill the hall, enough to bounce off the high stone ceiling and come back down, doubled, trebled, wrapped around her from every direction. The bastard daughter of a traitor, rejected by the king himself, in front of everyone. Of course. She felt the bond snap, felt it in the place it lived in the deep animal center of her, below thought, below language, in the oldest part of the self that the mind has no real dominion over. The snap of it was physical, absolute, like a rope under full tension suddenly parting, the two ends whipping back into nothing. Her wolf went silent. The silence was worse than the scream. And then something moved in Mara that she did not plan, and could not have predicted, and certainly could not explain. She smiled. Not performance, not armor, not the brittle, practiced expression of a woman holding herself together in public. This was something that came from underneath all of that, from whatever place inside her the shadows had been waiting in all this time, patient as geology, quiet as deep water. It rose through her and it reached her face, and it was real. Corvain went still. In the middle of the laughing crowd, in the center of the ceremony, in the full and public performance of a rejection that should have ended her, he went completely still. He was watching her smile the way you watch something you don't have a category for yet, with the focused, almost scientific attention of a mind encountering a thing that doesn't fit its existing architecture. She saw it. The flicker. Not of guilt. Not yet. Not him. Not at this stage. Something stranger. Something that lived right at the boundary of fear and fascination. That territory where the two feelings bleed into each other and become indistinguishable. He was afraid of her smile, and he could not look away from it. And then the candles went out. Not one. Not a draft catching a flame in some ordinary corner. All of them. Every torch, every candle, every burning thing in the great hall, extinguished at once as if the dark itself had exhaled, as if something enormous had drawn a single massive breath, and taken every light with it. The laughter stopped. In the sudden, total dark, something crackled at the edges of the room. Along the walls where the shadows lived, where stone met stone in the deep joints of old architecture, something moved. Not light, the opposite of light. Darkness that had density to it, that rolled and gathered and leaned inward like weather coming down from high ground. A sound like glass under pressure, the high, thin complaint of something pushed past tolerance, and then the candelabra nearest Mara simply shattered. Iron and wax exploding outward, shards scattering across stone, people lurching back from the spray of it. Then the next one. Then 3 more in rapid succession, like a fuse burning down a line toward something much larger. The crowd broke. That orderly, ranked, ceremonially arranged assembly of the most powerful wolves in the kingdom came apart at the seams in seconds, pushing back from the center, crushing toward the walls and exits, the animal brain taking over completely, because whatever was happening in this hall was not in any ceremony they had ever attended. Mara stood in the center of it. She had not moved. Her hands were at her sides. Her eyes were open, and she was not afraid. That was the thing that would stay with every wolf who was in that hall for the rest of their lives. Not the shattered candelabras, not the moving shadows, not the darkness that felt like it breathed. What they would remember, what would come back in the quiet hours, was the girl standing in the middle of all of it, with her spine straight and her chin level, and no fear anywhere on her face. Like it recognized her, like it was coming home. Corvain moved. He didn't decide to. That was the truth of it. There was no decision, no calculation, no the king weighing options and selecting the most strategically sound response. His body moved before his mind issued the instruction, crossing the distance between them in the fast, fluid way of a wolf closing ground, and he put himself between Mara and the crowd, his back to her, his face to the hall, arms slightly out from his sides, not aggressive, not a fighting stance, something more primal than that, the posture of a wolf standing over something it will not allow to be touched. Duran saw it. Duran's face did a very complicated thing. The shadows at the edges of the hall churned once, deeply, like something vast turning over in deep water. And then, slowly, they stilled. The darkness retreated back to where darkness was supposed to live. The hall settled into a breathless, shattered quiet. Corvain stood exactly where he was. His breathing was controlled. His heartbeat was not. Behind him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her without touching, Mara stood in the wreckage of the ceremony and looked at the back of the man who had just rejected her in front of 1,000 witnesses. The man whose body had moved without permission, without thought, to stand between her and everything. His wolf was no longer still. It was pressing hard against the inside of his ribs, furious and certain and absolutely without interest in the decision his human mind had just made. The seer's words sat in the front of his skull where he couldn't push them back. He didn't look at Mara. He couldn't yet, because he already knew with the bone-deep certainty of a man who has spent his life learning to read truth even when it is inconvenient. Even when it is catastrophic, he already knew that what he had done tonight had not ended anything. It had only made everything more dangerous. For both of them, she expected them to throw her out before dawn. That was the rational outcome. That was the logical conclusion to everything that had happened in the Great Hall. The rejection, the shadows, the shattered iron, the way the crowd had broken apart like a spooked herd. The sensible next move for an alpha king who had just publicly severed a mate bond and then watched forbidden power detonate in his own ceremony hall was to remove the source of the problem. Quietly, efficiently, with whatever thin justification the council required to make it look like law rather than fear. She had even packed. Not much. She didn't own much. A change of clothes. The small carved bone her mother had left behind. The only thing that hadn't been confiscated or destroyed in the years after the execution, and the practical knowledge of a woman who had learned to be ready to move at short notice. She sat on the edge of her cot in the servants' quarter and she waited, and she was calm about it, because she had made her peace with worse than exile and the shadows were still there, still present in the corners of the small room, still carrying that low, warm hum that had started the moment they first moved toward her in the hall. She was not alone in herself anymore. Whatever that meant, whatever was going to come of it, she was not alone. The knock, when it came, was not the rough, impatient knock of guards with orders. It was one knock, precise, the knock of someone accustomed to announcing themselves rather than requesting entry. She opened the door. Duran stood in the corridor, torch in hand, with the expression of a man executing an instruction he had not been given an opportunity to debate. He looked at her packed bundle on the cot. He looked at her. Something passed through his face that might, in different circumstances, have been something close to respect. The king wants you. The war room was not a room most people were ever invited into. It was deep in the east wing, behind two sets of reinforced doors, and it smelled of old maps and iron and the particular dry cold of a space where consequential things had been decided for a very long time. The table at its center was scarred with generations of use candle burns, blade marks, the ghost impressions of objects pressed hard against wood during arguments that had probably changed the shape of kingdoms. Corvain was standing at the far end of it when she was brought in. He wasn't looking at the maps spread across the table. He was looking at nothing, that specific, unfocused focus of a man thinking hard enough that the outer world had temporarily ceased to register. His hands were flat on the table's surface. His shoulders carried the full weight of whatever he was carrying, and it was clearly considerable. He looked up when she entered. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The silence between them was different from the silences she was accustomed to. Those were the silences of people who had decided she was beneath acknowledgement. This was the silence of two people in a room together who both had things they were not ready to say, and both knew it, and were taking the measure of each other before anyone committed to a direction. Two senior council members stood against the far wall. She recognized them: Elder Vance, whose opinion of her she could have written verbatim without asking, and Councillor Rhea, who was more careful with her contempt and therefore more dangerous. They watched her cross the room with the attentive wariness of people who had seen the candelabras shatter and had not yet finished being afraid. Good, some quiet part of her thought. Let them be afraid. She stopped at the opposite end of the table from Corvain and waited. He spoke without preamble. There is a blight moving across the northern territories. He said it the way he said most things, flat, direct, stripping the sentence down to its essential load-bearing structure. No theater, no cushioning. She had heard the word before, in whispers, in the low, urgent conversations of senior wolves that stopped when she came too close. She had assembled a rough picture from fragments, something wrong in the northern forests, trees dying in patterns that didn't follow any natural disease logic. Wolves going silent, losing their bonds, losing their wolves entirely, and becoming something between human and empty. A spreading wrongness with no identified source and no identified cure. Shadow magic is the only recorded force that has stopped a blight, he continued. In the Third Era, a wolf with abilities structurally identical to, a pause so brief she almost missed it, to what was demonstrated tonight. She let that sit for a moment. You want me to stop it? I want you to help develop the capacity to stop it, under controlled conditions, supervised, with full council oversight. You want me to stay? His jaw was very tight. I want the kingdom not to fall to a supernatural contagion. Those aren't the same answer. Councillor Rhea made a sound against the wall. Elder Vance's expression compressed into something that communicated a detailed opinion without using any words. Corvain looked at her with that same arrested quality she had seen in the courtyard, in the hall, that look that did not quite fit into any of the categories she had for how men in power looked at women like her. No, he said quietly, they're not. She should have felt something triumphant about that, should have stored it away as a small tactical victory, a point scored in a game she hadn't agreed to play. Instead, she felt the bond severed, silent, but leaving a scar the way all cuts leave scars pulse once, faint and aching, in the place it used to live. She agreed, because the blight was real, and she could feel the shadow power moving in her like a tide that was going to go somewhere whether she directed it or not, and because agreeing was different from surrendering, and she had learned long ago to know the difference. But mostly because leaving had stopped feeling like the thing she wanted to do. She was not ready to examine why. She was given a room that was not the servants' quarter. This bothered more people than she had capacity to care about. She heard it in the adjusted silences when she walked corridors that were not the back corridors. Felt it in the recalibrated stares, still hostile, most of them, but now laced with something more complex, something that understood she had moved on the board and was adjusting strategy accordingly. She was 3 days into her new position, which had no title and no formal definition, and existed entirely in the contested gray space between asset and prisoner when Corvain came to find her himself. She was in the East Courtyard. She had discovered, through quiet experimentation, that open sky made the shadow power easier to manage, that it needed space the way fire needed air, that containing it in enclosed rooms created pressure that led to the kind of unscheduled demolition the Great Hall had already experienced. She was standing in the middle of the courtyard in the thin, early morning light, eyes closed, breathing slowly, feeling the shadows at the edges of the yard the way you feel the edges of a room in the dark, not seeing, just knowing. She felt him before she heard him. His presence had a gravity to it that her bond scar responded to whether she invited it or not. A warmth that moved against her awareness like weather. She did not open her eyes immediately. "You're supposed to wait for the training session," she said. "I'm not here for the training session." She opened her eyes. He was closer than she expected. Not crowding her, there was still distance. Still the careful, maintained space of a man who had decided on a boundary and was honoring it with a precision that suggested honoring it was not entirely natural. He was looking at her with that direct, unreadable attention, and in the thin morning light, she could see things in his face that the ceremony hall's drama had obscured. The exhaustion, the weight of something he was carrying that had been heavy for a long time. The specific kind of solitude that belonged to people for whom power had eliminated the possibility of being known. She recognized it. She had worn it herself, for different reasons, for most of her life. "You should consider leaving the courtyard after dawn," he said. "The warriors begin rotation at 6th bell. You will attract attention," she offered. "I'm fairly practiced at that." Something shifted in his expression. Almost a reaction. Not quite. He moved, slightly, adjusting his angle toward her, and then stopped. His hand had lifted without his instruction, fingers closing around her wrist for the span of a single second before he registered it and released her. The touch lasted almost nothing. Her skin remembered it like a brand. He stepped back. The muscle in his jaw was working in that way she was beginning to recognize as Corvain processing something he had not yet found language for. "You shouldn't look at me like that," he said. His voice had dropped to something lower, something that had stopped being formal and started being something else without making any announcement about it. She considered him. "Like what?" "Like you're not afraid of me." She let the silence sit for exactly long enough. "Would you prefer that I was?" He looked at her for a long moment. He didn't answer. He left, but she noticed that he walked away slower than he'd arrived. The training sessions were, by any objective measure, a disaster dressed up as progress. Not because the power wasn't responding. It was. Erratically, defiantly, with the temperament of something that had been suppressed for too long, and was not inclined to be managed by someone else's schedule now that it had finally found room to breathe, but it was responding. The shadows moved when she focused, gathered and released and shifted direction under her attention, with a precision that improved day by day in ways that the council's observer, a tight-mouthed senior mage named Solace, who wrote everything down and touched, nothing noted in his ledger, with an expression of reluctant, professional acknowledgement. The disaster was everything around it. The yard they used for training was in the secondary practice ground, the one behind the armory, with high stone walls and enough open sky to give the power room without giving it direct access to any important architecture. Corvain ran the sessions himself. That had been his condition, not delegated, not supervised at a distance. Present, directly involved. She had her theories about why. She kept them to herself. The sessions had a texture that no one had explicitly designed, and no one knew how to dismantle. Corvain would give an instruction something technical, something focused on breathing or intention or the specific quality of attention that seemed to direct the shadows most effectively, and she would attempt it, and somewhere in the attempt they would end up closer together than the instruction required. And then there would be a recalibration, a stepping back, a return to the careful professional distance that fooled neither of them. On the fourth day, she was working on containment learning to draw the shadow energy inward rather than letting it radiate, a skill that was less dramatic and more important. And Corvain came to stand behind her left shoulder to correct her arm position. His hand closed over her forearm, adjusting the angle, purely instructional, 3 seconds maximum. The shadow energy spiked so dramatically that the training yard went dark for half a second and Solace dropped his ledger. They both stepped back, both staring forward, neither commenting. Solace retrieved his ledger. The warriors stationed at the yard's perimeter had developed the collective habit of watching the training sessions with a quality of attention that had very little to do with security protocol. She was aware of them. She was aware, specifically, of a broad-shouldered senior warrior named Aldrich who had decided, for reasons that were either attraction or the desire to demonstrate that he was more open-minded than his peers, to be visibly, conspicuously pleasant to her. He held doors. He said her name correctly, which in this pack was not as universal as it should have been. He found reasons to be in whatever corridor she was in. On the 6th day, he materialized at the edge of the training yard mid-session and leaned against the wall and watched her with an expression that was more personal than professional. She felt the change in atmosphere before she located the source. A low sound, barely audible, but present, the kind of sound that bypassed the ears and arrived directly in the nervous system. Corvain had stopped mid-instruction. He was looking at Aldrich against the wall with an expression that was very, very controlled, and a stillness that was not the comfortable stillness of a man at ease, but the specific stillness of a wolf, exerting active dominance over its own impulse. The growl was soft, but every person in the yard heard it. Aldrich's spine straightened. His eyes dropped. He found somewhere else to be within about 4 seconds. Mara looked at Corvain. Corvain looked at the empty space Aldrich had occupied, then smoothly redirected his gaze to the shadow work she was supposed to be doing, in the tone of a man resuming a meeting after a minor administrative interruption. "Focus," he said. "Your left shoulder is dropping again." She turned back to her work. "You're a complete control freak," she said, pleasantly, conversationally, like discussing weather. The pause lasted 3 full seconds. "I am an Alpha King managing a catastrophic supernatural crisis." Another pause. "You're doing it again." "I'm working." "You're smiling." "I can work and smile." "Mara." She let the smile stay exactly where it was. The shadows curled lazily at the edges of the yard, warm and present, with the particular quality of something that was not worried at all about where this was going. She was beginning to think it had known, from the very first moment in the great hall, before she did, before either of them did. She was beginning to think the shadows had always known exactly where this was going. She found out the way she found out most true things in Ironvale. Not because someone told her, because she was paying attention when no one thought she was worth watching. It was the 12th day of training. Late afternoon, the light going amber and thin across the practice yard, the shadows lengthening in the way she had come to enjoy that particular quality of early evening dark that made her power feel less like a wound and more like breathing. They had been working for 2 hours. The session had gone well, by their emerging and unspoken standard of well, which meant the shadows had moved with intention rather than emotion, and nothing structural had been damaged, and they had only stood too close to each other twice. She was running the containment exercise, drawing the dark energy inward, compressing it, holding it the shadow equivalent of holding your breath, which required a stillness she was still developing. Corvain was watching from 6 feet away with his arms crossed and his assessment face on, the one that gave her nothing and was somehow, despite giving her nothing, entirely readable to her now. She released the compression too fast. The energy dispersed outward in a cold wave, not destructive, just ambient, a rush of shadow-chilled air that swept across the yard and hit Corvain full in the chest. She heard his sharp intake of breath, saw him take a single step back, and then she saw the ice. It moved fast, too fast to be a response to the cold air she'd released. It was already there when she looked, crawling up from below his left sleeve, a pale frost lattice spreading across the back of his hand and up his wrist, branching like something organic, something alive, climbing toward his elbow with the steady, purposeful movement of a thing that knew exactly where it was going and had been going there for a long time. He saw her see it. His arm dropped. The sleeve came down. The motion was so practiced, so immediate, so absolutely without hesitation that she understood at once it was not the first time he had covered it. It was reflex. It was the physical memory of years of covering it. "Continue the exercise," he said. She walked toward him. "Mara." She took his wrist. Not roughly. Not a demand. Her fingers closed around his sleeve and she pushed it back. And he let her. That was the thing she would think about later, in the dark, when she was assembling what she knew about this man into something coherent. He let her. He stood there with his jaw set and his eyes fixed on a point above her head, and he let her push back his sleeve and look at what was underneath. The frost lattice had faded but left its record on his skin, a tracery of pale marks, barely visible against his forearm, the kind of faint scarring that meant this had happened before, many times before. The pattern of it was not random. It moved in specific lines, specific directions, following the paths of veins with a precision that looked less like frost and more like something that knew the architecture of his body intimately. She pressed 2 fingers flat against the marks. Still cold, deep cold, the kind that lived in stone walls in winter, that came from somewhere older than the surface. She had lived her whole life adjacent to things other wolves feared, and she knew the feeling of power that had been present for a very long time. This was not new. This was not injury. This was inheritance. She looked up at him. "How long?" A muscle moved in his face. "Since I was crowned." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her then. Really looked at her. The way he very rarely did without the managed surface in place. Without the careful architecture of composure fully assembled. Just him. Just this. "The curse follows the bloodline," he said. "Every king in my line. It accelerates after the coronation. The cold moves inward, year by year." He paused. "My father was 38 when it reached his heart." The silence landed hard. She did the arithmetic. She already knew his age. She knew it the way she knew all the basic facts of the world she lived in incidentally. Unavoidably, through years of proximity to a pack that discussed their king the way weather is discussed. A constant condition. 34. She kept her fingers against the cold marks on his arm, and she looked at him and she made herself say the thing she already knew. "The seer. On the night of the ceremony, that's what she told you." Not a question. His silence confirmed it. "She told you what would happen to a mate bonded to a man carrying this curse." "She told me what happened to my father's mate," he said. "When the cold reached him, what the bond transferred." Another pause, harder than the first. "She died the same night he did. The bond carried it. There was she had no warning, no chance to." He stopped. She stood there with the cold of his curse still sitting in her fingertips, and she looked at Corvain Alpha King Corvain, immovable, ungovernable, the wolf who had stood in front of 1,000 witnesses and cut the bond between them with his own voice, and she saw him. Not the king. The man who had looked at his mate across a crowded hall and done the calculation and decided that her life was worth more than the bond. Who had stood there and let her hate him for it rather than explain. Who had covered the ice on his arm every single day and carried this alone because that was the only option that didn't end with her dying beside him. "You're an idiot, Your Majesty." He blinked. The flatness broke slightly, just at the edges. Something startled and almost young moving briefly in his expression. "I beg you're an absolute idiot." She said it with complete calm. "Enormous idiot. Historically significant. Mara, you thought that would make me leave." He went still. She looked up at him and she did not soften it, and she did not look away. "You thought if you rejected me publicly and made yourself into a villain in front of everyone I knew, I would go. I would put distance between us and stay alive and never know the real reason." She paused. "And you thought that was the kind thing to do." The yard was absolutely silent. The shadows had gathered close without her inviting them. Not threateningly, protectively, the way they moved when she was sitting with something real, something that required the older kind of witnessing. It was the only available option, he said. His voice had dropped to that register again. The low one, the one that had stopped being formal. The bond transfers the curse. If I had accepted it, if we had, I know what the bond transfers. Then you understand. I understand that you made a decision about my life, she said, without asking me. That landed. She watched it land, watched him receive it the way he received difficult truths fully, without deflecting, with the particular quality of a man who had been taught that integrity required you to sit with the weight of things rather than redirecting it elsewhere. She let go of his arm, but she didn't step back. My power comes from shadow, she said. Whatever your curse is made of, whatever the cold is, it's not shadow. It's not the same source. She held his gaze. You don't know that the bond would transfer it to me. You don't know that I couldn't hold it. You don't know what my power is actually capable of because neither of us does yet. The frost marks on his arm had faded. Just slightly. Just where her fingers had been. Neither of them looked at it, but they both felt it. He looked at her for a long time in the amber evening light, and she could see the thing moving in his face, not the conflict of the rejection night, not the tearing apart of a man choosing between two terrible options. Something different, something more careful. The look of a man who has been carrying something so long that being offered help feels less like relief, and more like a thing he doesn't quite know how to receive. I am still going to die before 40, he said. Flat, not self-pitying, just factual. The way he said all difficult things. Maybe, she said, but you don't get to decide that I'd rather not know you than know you. The silence after that was the longest one. And then barely, just at the corners. Just enough that if she hadn't been standing close enough to feel the cold of his curse in her hands, she might have missed it. He almost smiled. She never saw her father coming. That was the thing she would return to, afterward, in the fragments of the days that followed. Not what happened, what she had missed, what she had not felt in time. She had been so focused on learning to sense the shadows, to read the power that was native to her, that she had not considered that something darker could use it as a signal, could track her through the very thing she was learning to control, could follow the thread back to its source. It was the 15th morning. Training had not yet begun. She was in the corridor outside the armory, earlier than usual. The pack house still dim and quiet in the thin pre-dawn dark when the cold hit her. Not Corvain's cold. Different. Wrong cold. Dead cold. The cold of something that had taken the blight into itself deliberately, had invited it, had let it eat through warmth and life and whatever had once been human or wolf in it, and had decided the trade was acceptable. She had 3 seconds of warning. Then the wall to her left exploded inward. The stone didn't crumble. It was pushed deliberately, with a kind of controlled catastrophic force that was not random destruction but surgical removal. Dust and debris cascaded across the corridor. She threw herself back against the opposite wall, hands up, shadow power surging to the surface without instruction, the way it always moved when she was threatened, fast and total and completely without interest in her thoughts on the matter. Through the gap in the broken wall, through the early morning dark and the drifting stone dust, a man walked in. She knew him. She knew him the way you know something you have tried very hard not to carry, the way you know the shape of a wound that healed wrong. Her father. He looked nothing like she remembered. She had been 4 when he was exiled. The memory she had of him was a child's memory, impressionistic, more feeling than image, large hands, a voice that filled rooms, the specific quality of attention he paid to people when he wanted something from them. That last part had not changed. He was looking at her now with an attention so complete and so entirely transactional that it stripped the last fragile thing she had never quite been able to name and bury. The hope, maybe. The small, stupid hope that surviving parents feel toward their children out of something other than calculation. There was no warmth in his face. There was recognition. Assessment. The look of a man who has located a resource. Behind him, through the gap in the wall, she could see them figures moving in the dark beyond the pack house perimeter, not wolves. something wrong in their movement, something that registered in her animal brain as fundamentally incorrect about the way they inhabited their own bodies. Blighted. Empty wolves, the bond and the self eaten out of them, left as vessels for whatever her father was using to direct them. Mara. His voice was the same, room, filling, warm on the surface. You've grown. She said nothing. I've been watching you, he continued, moving forward slowly, the careful pace of something that wanted to appear unthreatening and wasn't quite managing it. What you did in the ceremony hall, I felt it from the northern border. Do you understand how far that reached? The shadows in the corridor were pressing close to her, dense and agitated, cycling in short, restless patterns. That power belongs to our bloodline, he said. To me first. It always should have come to me. Your mother took it and locked it in you without my knowledge, and then she died before I could retrieve it. Retrieve. She absorbed that word, the specific coldness of it, the way it made her something owned. You are going to give it to me, he said, willingly, because the alternative, no, simple, immediate, no hesitation and no drama, because there was nothing to hesitate about and nothing that required drama. His face moved, just slightly, the surface warmth thinning. He raised one hand. 3 of the blighted figures from outside came through the gap in the wall. She threw her hands up and the shadows erupted outward, a shockwave of dark energy that hit all 3 of them and drove them backward, slamming them into the broken wall with enough force to crack stone further. Not destroying them. The blight made them resistant, but buying seconds. Her father stepped forward through the dispersing shadow energy, one arm raised against it, his own dark power colder than hers, denser, wrong in its texture. The way all things are wrong when they have been taken, rather than grown pressing back against hers. You can't sustain that, he said. You've had 15 days of training. I've had 30 years. He was not wrong. She could feel it, the power differential, the way her shadows frayed against his resistance, the edge of her control beginning to blur the way it always blurred under sustained pressure. Her back hit the corridor wall. He raised his hand toward her face. The sound that came from behind him was not loud, but every blighted figure in the corridor went still when they heard it. Corvain came through the far door at a pace that was not running but covered distance, the way a breaking wave covers distance inevitably, totally, with the full weight of something that had been moving toward this point for much longer than the last 30 seconds. Behind him, Duran and 2 senior warriors spread into flanking positions with the seamless coordination of wolves who had trained together for years. Corvain's eyes found her first. A single sweep assessing, cataloging, and then something that was not assessment at all moving underneath it. Something that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with the 3 feet of distance between her and her father's hand. He stepped between them. Her father turned. The 2 men looked at each other across the corridor, and the air between them was the specific quality of air between 2 sources of tremendous pressure, charged, dense, the atmosphere before something breaks. Step back from her, Corvain said. His voice was entirely level. Entirely level was somehow worse than fury. Her father smiled. The room-filling smile, the performance of ease from a man who did not feel ease. Alpha King, this is a family matter. She is under my protection. She is my blood. She is... Corvain stopped. Something moved in his face, brief and fierce and completely unguarded. She is not your resource. Her father's smile stayed in place, but it had lost its warmth entirely. Just the shape of it left, just the architecture. He moved, faster than she expected, faster than the corridor's close quarters should have allowed, the blight giving him a wrong physics quality of motion that her father had turned into a weapon. His hand shot out toward her shoulder, bypassing Corvain's guard by a fraction, and caught it. His hand closed on her shoulder. Corvain's response was not tactical. It was not the measured response of a king managing a strategic situation. The sound he made was the oldest sound. A wolf makes the one that lives below language, below thought, in the place where the bond lives even when it's been severed, even when the mind has denied it, even when every rational decision says otherwise. He took her father's wrist, removed his hand from her shoulder with a force that was controlled only in the sense that it did not break bone. Then he looked at her father with the complete stillness of a wolf that has passed the point where anger lives and arrived somewhere older and more final. "Touch her again," he said, "and I will burn your entire bloodline. No performance, no theatrics, just the truth of it." Her father looked at the hand still closed around his wrist, at the ice crawling up Corvain's arm, visible now, visible to everyone, because Corvain had not covered it, had not retreated, was standing in full knowledge of his own curse, with the cold moving openly across his skin, and his eyes fixed on her father, with the complete indifference of a man who has decided that some things matter more than his own survival. Something moved in her father's face. Not fear, exactly. Something more calculating. A reassessment. Behind him, the blighted figures shifted. The corridor erupted. She threw her power outward. Corvain moved through it, through the shadows, which parted for him the way they parted for her, smooth and instinctive, as if they already knew him, and the battle compressed itself into the close, chaotic geometry of corridor fighting. Bodies and power, and the crack of stone and the sounds of wolves doing the oldest thing wolves do. She fought. She fought with everything she had, with 15 days of training and a lifetime of compressed fury, and the shadow power moving through her with a clarity it had never had before, because she had something to protect now. Some anchor in the present that made the power purposeful instead of wild. Her father retreated. Not defeated, not yet, but recalculating. Pulling back his blighted figures with the cool efficiency of a man repositioning rather than withdrawing, eyes still fixed on her, as he moved back through the gap in the wall with the patience of something that had been waiting long before today, and was prepared to wait longer. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." Then he was gone. The corridor settled into the particular silence of aftermath, heavy, breathing, the kind of quiet that follows violence and carries the full weight of everything that just happened and everything it means going forward. She found Corvain 3 feet away. He was bleeding. A cut along his left side, deep enough to matter, from a piece of exploded stone or a glancing blighted strike. She hadn't seen it happen, and she hated that she hadn't seen it. The ice on his arm had retreated but left its marks. He was standing fully upright, fully present, with the particular quality of a man holding himself together through the combination of adrenaline and will, and the refusal to let anyone in this corridor see him diminish. She crossed to him without deciding to. Her hand went to the cut without asking permission. He looked down at her hand, then at her face. "I'm fine," he said. "You're bleeding. Wolves heal." "Corvain." He went quiet. She pressed the fabric of his shirt gently against the cut, and she looked up at him, and she was very close, and neither of them moved back. "You called me by name," he said. Quiet, noting it. "I know your name. You've never used it." She held his gaze. "Get used to it," she said. The shadows pooled warm and patient around them both in the ruined corridor. And somewhere in the ice-marked lines of his arm, pressed under her hand, she felt it faint, tentative, the ghost of something that had been severed and was trying, against all reason, against all odds, against every decision both of them had made and every force that had been arranged against them from birth, trying to find its way back. The days after the attack moved differently. Not slower, not faster, differently. With the particular altered texture of time after something has shifted in the underlying structure of things, when the same corridors and the same routines carry a different weight, because the people moving through them are not quite the same people they were before. Something had been said in that ruined corridor. Not in words. In the way he had crossed the distance. In the way his voice had dropped to that final register when he said, "Touch her again." In the way neither of them had stepped back. Nothing had been named. They were both, in their separate and characteristic ways, avoiding naming it. She understood his reasons. She had assembled them carefully over the preceding days. The curse, the math of it, the father before him and the father before that, the seer's words on the night of the ceremony, the specific kind of love that expresses itself as removal rather than pursuit, because it believes that is the more honest form of protection. She understood it. Understanding it did not make it less frustrating, but it gave her something to work with. He trained her harder in the days after the attack. More hours, more intensity, more of the contained, focused pressure of a man channeling something that had no other outlet into the one task he could justify. She matched him, pushed back against the difficulty of each session with the quiet ferocity she had been developing her whole life, the kind of endurance that isn't dramatic because it has been practiced so long, it has become structural. It was just the way she was made now, the same way stone is made by what it has survived. Her control was becoming real. Not perfect, not reliable under every condition, but real, the shadow power responding to her intention, with a consistency that felt less like luck and more like a relationship developing its own grammar. She was learning its language. It was learning her limits. They were arriving, together, at something workable. Corvain watched this with an expression she had catalogued and still could not fully translate. Pride was part of it. Something more complicated lived beneath the pride. Something that looked at her growing capability and felt, she thought, the specific bittersweet quality of a man watching something beautiful that he believes he will not be present to see fully realized. She noticed when the ice came. She always noticed now. Knew the tells, the almost imperceptible stiffening in his left arm, the single careful breath he used to manage it, the way his jaw set a fraction tighter on the days it moved higher. She tracked it the way you track weather when you live somewhere. Weather can kill you, with attention, with the intent to be prepared. On the evening of the 19th day, they were in the training yard later than usual. The blight had pushed further south, reports coming in from the border scouts with increasing frequency, each one painting a wider picture of the wrongness spreading across the northern territories. The urgency of it lived in every session now, that background pressure of a clock running, of something terrible moving toward them at a pace that didn't care about their readiness. They had been working for 3 hours. She was exhausted in the clean, satisfying way of real exertion, the kind that meant the work had been genuine, that she had given the session everything and the session had taken it. She was sitting on the low stone bench at the yard's edge, the shadows settled and quiet around her, her breathing evening out. Corvain was standing at the center of the yard with his back to her. He had not moved in a while. She watched him. The line of his shoulders told her something was happening before anything else did. She had become, without planning to, fluent in his posture, the way certain pressures showed up in the set of his spine, the angle of his head, the quality of his stillness. This was not the controlled stillness. This was something being held back, something being managed at the edge of its containment. Corvain. He turned slowly. The ice was on his hand, both hands, moving up his forearms with a speed she had never seen from it before, faster than the afternoon in the training yard, faster than the corridor, branching and climbing and bright against his skin in the torchlight like something finally freed from restraint. His face was the thing that stopped her breathing. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has stopped managing his expression, who has run out of the capacity for it, or made a decision, somewhere in the last 3 hours, that he was finished with it. The look was total. It was the look that had been living underneath every careful distance, every controlled breath, every redirected gaze in every corridor and training yard for 19 days. It was all of it, at once, without the layer that had kept it from landing on her directly. She stood up. "I rejected you," he said, "because I knew." His voice was the quiet one, the real one. "I knew within a week of the coronation, when my wolf first felt the bond beginning, before the ceremony, before the seer. I knew what you were to me." He paused. The ice moved over his wrist. He looked at it the way he looked at all difficult things directly, without flinching. "And I knew that I was not capable of being indifferent to you, that if I accepted the bond, if I let it complete, I would love you." The word sat in the cold air between them. He had not softened it, had not qualified it or wrapped it in something more manageable. Just the word, placed down with the careful precision of a man who had been holding it for a long time and had finally put it somewhere it could be seen. "And loving you would mean watching you die beside me," he said, "because the bond would carry the curse, and there would be nothing, no power, no medicine, no prayer to the moon that could stop it transferring. And I would rather, his voice compressed just slightly, I would rather you hate me for a lifetime than be with you for 4 years and kill you. She crossed the yard. She didn't decide to. She arrived in front of him the way water arrives at the lowest point, inevitably, entirely, without drama. She looked up at him. Idiot, she said. Soft, entirely without venom. Something moved in his face. Mara. I know. She reached for his arm. The ice was past his elbow now. I heard every word, I understood every word, and I am still standing here. You don't understand what the transfer... I understand that my power comes from shadow, she said. I understand that your curse is not shadow. I understand that the bond between a mate with shadow abilities and an alpha carrying a cold curse has never been tested because the moon has never made this particular combination before. She held his gaze. And I understand that you have been deciding what I can survive without asking me. I'm trying to protect you. I know. She turned his arm over gently, pressed her palm flat against the frost lattice, the way she had that first afternoon, and felt the cold move under her hand, not retreating this time, moving too fast to retreat. I know exactly what you're trying to do, and I know it comes from the same place as every other impossible thing you carry by yourself. She looked up. But you don't get to do it anymore. His free hand came up. Slow, careful. Like a man reaching for something he has told himself he has no right to reach for. Making the reach anyway because the alternative has finally become impossible. His fingers touched her face. Just that. Just his hand against her jaw, his thumb at the corner of her cheekbone, the lightest possible contact from a man who had been managing distance for 19 days. She felt it everywhere. Felt the bond scar respond, that severed thread stirring in the deep place where it lived, pulling toward the warmth of his touch with the blind, faithful motion of something that had been waiting, had always been waiting, would wait as long as it needed to. I rejected you because I knew I would love you, he said again, quietly, as if saying it twice made it more survivable. And I love you now, and I do not know how to stop that from being the thing that ends you. She opened her mouth to answer. And then he collapsed. Not slowly. Not with warning. The ice detonated across his chest in a single catastrophic surge. She saw it happen. Saw the frost lattice spread under his shirt in the space between one breath and the next, spreading across his sternum, up his throat, and the sound he made was not a cry but a sharp, truncated exhale, the sound of air being forced out by something cold closing around the space that held it. His knees hit the stone. She was already down with him, both hands on his chest, feeling the ice beneath her palms solid, deep, the cold of it moving under her hands with a purpose that frightened her more than the attack in the corridor, more than her father, more than anything, because this was not external. This was not something she could put herself between him and, this was inside him. This was the bloodline's long, patient work, and it had reached his heart. Corvain. She kept her voice steady, made it steady. Stay with me. His eyes found her. He was on both hands now, fighting to stay upright, fighting the cold with the same quality of will he brought to everything total, furious, refusing. Stay with me, she said again. Something in her chest broke open. Not broke like damage, broke like a door. The shadow power came up from the deepest part of her. Not in the controlled, directed way she had been learning in the yard, not the contained precision of 3 weeks of training, but the full thing, the original thing, the power that had answered her in the ceremony hall when 1,000 wolves were waiting for her to fall. It came up complete and total, and it knew, with a certainty that bypassed her entirely, exactly what it needed to do. She pressed both hands flat against his chest and she let it go. The shadows poured into him. She felt it the moment they touched the curse, felt the collision of 2 old powers, 2 different darknesses, one that had been invited and fed and one that had been there since before either of them were born. And the cold pushed back, hard, with everything it had accumulated over 4 generations of patient inheritance. She pushed harder. The yard went black, not dark. Black, the absolute light-consuming black of deep shadow given full expression, the kind she had only touched the edges of before, the kind that the power had been building toward since the first moment it moved toward her in the ceremony hall. She was inside it now, not observing it. Inside it, operating it, the shadow energy moving through her and through Corvain simultaneously, finding the pathways of the curse and pressing against each one with the deliberate, patient force of something that had been waiting for exactly this task. The cold fought. She felt it fighting, felt it in her bones, in the place where the power moved through her, the chill of the curse trying to transfer direction, trying to find the easier path the bond had always offered, and pouring itself that way instead. She felt it enter her, and she held it, held the cold the way you hold something that wants to run, with both hands, with everything, not allowing it to complete itself in her, not allowing it to win. It wanted her. She had known it would. She held on. Mara. His voice was far away. Or she was far away, she couldn't tell anymore. Couldn't track the boundary between herself and the power and the cold and the dark with the precision she'd had a minute ago. The shadow energy was consuming attention at a rate that left nothing for ordinary awareness. She was running on something older than thought, on the same blind animal stubbornness that had carried her through kitchens that went quiet and training fields that turned their backs and a ceremony hall full of people waiting for her to shatter. She would not shatter. Mara, closer now. His hands on her face, she felt that, felt it through everything, through the cold and the dark and the enormous pressure of the power she was holding. His hands on her face the way her fingers had been on his arm. That same quality of touch, grounding, calling her back from somewhere she had gone too far into. "Stay with me," he said. The words landed differently when he said them. She heard every layer in them, heard the king and the man and the wolf and the specific aching weight of someone saying stay, who has spent years making himself stop asking people to stay. "That wasn't a request," she said. Her voice came out thinner than she intended, thinner than she wanted, but present, audible, present. She pushed the cold out of herself, felt it resist, felt it cling with the desperation of something being removed from a home it had occupied for a long time, and she compressed it, wrapped it in shadow the way you wrap fire to smother it, the dark closing around the cold completely, and she pushed. The ice on Corvain's chest cracked. She heard it a sound like frozen ground breaking in early spring, that fracturing quality of something too cold, too long, finally meeting something warmer. It spread across his sternum in a web of fracture lines, and then it fell away. Not melted. Broke. Came off in pieces that dissolved before they hit the stone. She felt him breathe. Deep. Real. The kind of breath that happens after something was almost not possible. She sagged. She was aware of the yard, the torch still burning, the shadows settling back to their ordinary places with the quiet satisfaction of something that had done what it came to do. She was aware of him, the warmth of him, the solidity of him, the way he held her with the complete absence of the careful maintained distances, with both arms, with his hand in her hair, with no management at all. "Stay with me," she said again, quieter now, into his chest. His arms tightened. "Yes," he said. Just that. Just yes. Not a decree, not a strategic decision, not the carefully calculated response of an alpha king managing a complicated situation. Just a man saying yes to the one thing he had been saying no to since the moment the moon tied them together. Finally unable to justify one more reason why not. The bond scar was warm. For the first time since the night it was severed. For the first time since that cold snap in the ceremony hall, surrounded by 1,000 witnesses, the place where the bond had been was warm. She closed her eyes. She breathed him in. Outside the walls, the blight was still moving south. Her father was still out there, recalculating, patient as stone. The council still had opinions. The kingdom still needed things from both of them that were complicated and dangerous and not finished. None of that had gone away. None of it was resolved. But in the training yard in the dark, with the shadows finally, genuinely at rest, Mira held on to the warmth of him and understood in the wordless, absolute way of something the body knows before the mind does, that the thing she had been told her whole life that she could not have, the thing she had trained herself not to want, The thing she had buried and protected and armored and covered in quiet endurance and careful pride, was here, was real, was holding her back. The blight came at dawn, not creeping, not the slow, patient advance of the previous weeks, that terrible incremental movement that gave you time to watch it coming and no ability to stop it. This was deliberate, accelerated. Her father had decided that recalculation was finished, and the time for patience was over, and the blight answered his decision the way it answered all his decisions completely, immediately, without question. She felt it before the scout's horn sounded. She woke from a dead sleep, with the shadows already moving in her room, cycling in tight, urgent patterns that communicated alarm without language. She was dressed and in the corridor before the first horn call finished, the power rising through her with a heat and readiness that was different from anything she had felt in the training yard. Not the careful, controlled warmth of directed practice, something older, something that understood what the morning required and had been preparing for it long before she had. The pack house was organized chaos, warriors moving to stations, council members appearing in corridors with the expressions of people confronting something they had theorized about and now had to inhabit. Duran was already at the east door when she came through it, Corvain at his side, both of them reading the incoming scout reports with the rapid, synchronized focus of men who had done this before, who knew how to operate together under pressure, without needing to negotiate each step. Corvain looked at her once when she arrived. His arm was clear. No ice. Not since the yard and that absence, that clean skin, where the frost lattice had spent years making its slow claim, was still something she hadn't fully absorbed. Still something she caught herself checking. Still something that made the shadow power warm in her chest with a satisfaction she couldn't entirely separate from the other warmth she carried now. He said nothing. She said nothing. They turned to face the east, where the sky had the wrong color, that bruised greenish dark that weather didn't make, that only came from the blight moving in volume and at speed. Her father was not hiding this time. He came through the eastern tree line at the head of what had once been a wolf pack. She did not know which pack, could not tell, looking at them, because the blight had done what it always did, had eaten the individual out of each wolf and left only the walking, the moving, the execution of direction, hundreds of them, moving in the particular wrong rhythm of blighted wolves, that offbeat synchronized wrongness that the animal brain recognized as a threat before the thinking brain caught up. Behind them, the trees where the blight had passed were gray, not dead in the natural way of dead things, emptied the way the wolves were emptied, the life and complexity scraped out and only the structure remaining, standing because there was nothing left to make it fall. Her father walked at the front. He looked less like a man than he had in the corridor. More of the blight was in him now, she could see it, the cold, dark energy moving visibly under his skin, the frost gray spreading from his hands toward his face, the price of what he had invited in. He had been using himself as a channel for too long. The blight was not a power that shared. It was a power that replaced. She wondered if he knew. She suspected he didn't care. He saw her at the pack house perimeter, and he stopped, and the hundreds of blighted wolves behind him stopped simultaneously. That terrible mirror movement, and the morning went very still. "Last chance," he said, across the distance. "Give me the power. Walk away. I have no interest in the rest of this." She looked at him, at the man who had chosen power over his pack, over his mate, over his child, who had made every trait available to him and called each one reasonable, who had watched the blight eat his wolves and calculated that the cost was acceptable because the goal was his. She thought of her mother, of what her mother had left inside her, not just the power, not just the shadows, but the capacity to carry something enormous without letting it consume her. The understanding that the difference between her father's power and her own was not the source, was not the darkness, was the direction, was what you used it for, was whether you fed the power with your own diminishment or built something with it that was larger than yourself. She raised her hands. "No," she said. The shadows came, not from her alone. They came from everywhere, from the tree line, from the gray morning sky, From the long darkness beneath the packhouse walls and the spaces between stones and the ordinary shadows of the waking world that had been waiting, she now understood, had always been waiting, for something with enough claim on the dark to call them. They answered her the way they had answered her in the ceremony hall, but where that had been surprise and awakening, a first breath, this was intention. This was the fully opened instrument playing its full register. Her father threw his power at her. She met it. The collision was not loud. That was the strange thing, that two forces of that scale meeting in the space of an open field made almost no sound, just a deep subsonic pressure that the wolves on both sides felt in their chests, dark against dark, cold against shadow. His power, with 30 years of deliberate cultivation behind it, fed on what he had taken and what he had emptied, and the long, patient accumulation of a man who had made his family name into something he was willing to die for, or kill for, hers with something different behind it. Not years of cultivation, not deliberate accumulation. What was behind hers was simpler, and in some ways harder to quantify. It was the full weight of everything she had survived and not let break her. The kitchens and the corridors and the turned backs and the rejection in the ceremony hall and the long years of being furniture in a world that kept deciding she did not count. It was the capacity she had built not to carry power but to carry difficulty. And it turned out those were the same muscle, developed in the same dark, available for the same work. She pushed. Her father pushed back. She felt the point where his power was genuinely stronger. Felt the moment it found the edge of what she had and leaned on it, and the edge held, but not easily, not without cost. She felt the shadow energy straining under the sustained pressure, and she understood, in that moment, that this was the decision, that she could hold indefinitely, or she could push completely, and there was no third option, no middle ground, no tactical retreat that ended well. She thought of Corvain's hands on her face. "Stay with me." She pushed completely. The shadows expanded outward in a wave that moved through every blighted wolf on the field simultaneously. She felt each contact, each point of entry, the shadow power finding the cold emptiness where the bond and the self had been, and filling it, not with her, not with anything that was hers to give, but with the original warmth of the thing the blight had removed. It was not healing. She was not powerful enough for healing, might never be, but she was powerful enough to break the hold, to sever the cord her father had run through each of them, and let whatever remained find its way back to itself. The blighted wolves dropped. Not violently. They simply stopped, stood for a moment between the states, between what they had been and what the blight had made them, and then sat down, or knelt, or simply went still with the quality of extreme exhaustion, of something returned from very far away. Her father roared, and she turned the full weight of the shadows on him. She did not want to. That was the truth she would carry forward, and never fully resolve she did not want to, because whatever he was and whatever he had chosen and whatever he had been willing to do, he was the only parent she had left, and the grief of that was real and inconvenient and present even in the middle of everything. She carried it. She held it, and she did not put it down, and she let it be there, because denying it would have been the first step toward becoming him. The shadows took the blight from him, pulled it out of him the way the cold had been pulled from Corvain's chest by force, by compression, by the refusal to allow something destructive to remain housed in a living body. It fought. It was more deeply rooted in him than in anyone else, because he had invited it, had welcomed it, had given it access rather than having it forced. When it came out, it was not graceful. He collapsed onto the gray field, and he was just a man diminished, old in a way the blight had been masking. His face, the face of someone who had hollowed himself out incrementally, and was now confronting the full extent of the hollowing for the first time, without anything to fill it. He looked at her from the ground. She looked back at him. She did not help him up, but she did not look away. She gave him that much: her eyes, her presence, the fact of her continued existence despite everything he had done and everything he had tried. She stood in front of him whole, and she let him see it, and then she turned back to her pack. Months moved the way months do after war, slowly at first. Then in a rush. The rebuilding had its own rhythm, its own demands. The northern territories, the wolves who had been blighted and were finding their way back to themselves, the diplomatic work of a kingdom that had survived a catastrophic assault and needed to understand what that meant going forward. The council, which had spent considerable energy being wrong about Mara, was in the process of recalibrating with the particular discomfort of institutions confronting the gap between their previous positions and current reality. She let them recalibrate. She had other things to attend to. Corvain's arm had been clean for 4 months. She checked it every morning, not because she didn't trust the outcome, but because the checking had become something else. A moment, a small, deliberate piece of ordinary intimacy in the days that were full of the business of kingdoms, and nothing ordinary at all. He submitted to it with an expression he was no longer fully managing. That was the change that mattered most, the thing she returned to when the days were long, not the political shifts, not the changed dynamics in the corridors of the pack house. The way he had stopped managing his expression around her, the way the face she saw now was just his face. The announcement came without warning. That was his style, she had learned. Not building to things, not structuring revelation. Direct, economical, strip the sentence to its load-bearing elements and place it down and let the weight of it do the work. He called a full pack assembly. She did not know why. She stood in the great hall, the same great hall, the same stone, the same torch brackets that had held the candelabras before. She shattered them on the worst night of her life, and she felt the pack assembling around her, and she felt for the first time the pack bond. Not completely, not in the full flood of belonging that wolves raised in healthy packs described, but present a thread of it, thin and new, the way new growth is thin and new, genuinely alive. The pack was changing, had been changing since the battlefield. She felt it in the way the silences had shifted quality, the way the doors opened differently, the way eyes that had spent years sliding past her had started to focus. She was becoming real to them. She stood at the edge of the assembled pack and felt this, and said nothing about it because some things were still too new to be spoken without being fragile. Corvain walked into the hall from the far end, past the assembled wolves, past the council members on their raised platform, past every ceremony and protocol the hall had ever hosted. He walked with that quality of contained inevitability that she now understood was not performance, was just him, was the way the wolf moved when the man had decided where it was going and both were in agreement. He stopped in front of her. The hall went quiet. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the face she had come to know as his actual face, not the managed surface, not the Alpha King's public instrument, the face that had appeared in the training yard, and in the corridor, and in the dark of the aftermath of the blight and had not gone back into hiding since. He went to one knee. The sound the hall made was the sound of 500 wolves experiencing an emotion simultaneously. A collective suspended breath, the sharp intake of something that had not been expected, had not been prepared for, that arrived complete and total, and took the room with it. Alpha King Corvain, on one knee, in the great hall, in front of everyone. He looked up at her. Mara Blackthorn. Her name in his mouth still did what it always did. Even now, even knowing him the way she knew him, there was a frequency to it that the bond scar responded to before her mind caught up, that warmth in the deep severed place moving with the same blind, faithful motion it had moved with in the training yard when he touched her face. "Will you accept me as your mate?" The hall held its breath. She looked down at him, at the man who had made the worst decision of her life out of love and told her so without flinching, who had covered the ice on his arm and carried the curse alone, and put himself between her and every threat that had come their way, including himself, who had said yes in the training yard with nothing left to manage, and had not found a reason to take it back since. She raised an eyebrow. "You already rejected me once." Something moved in his face. That almost smile. The real one, the one that only appeared when he had stopped trying to prevent it, the one that reached all the way to his eyes and changed the quality of his stillness from controlled to something that had no armor left in it at all. "I'll spend the rest of my life fixing that mistake," he said. The quiet in the hall had a different texture now, not the hostile silence of the rejection night. not the charged, suspended dread of a crowd that had come for cruelty. This was something the hall had perhaps never held before, the silence of 500 wolves leaning forward into something that felt like hope, that felt like the moon getting something right after a very long time of the pack believing it was incapable. She looked at him for one more moment. Let the moment be what it was: complete, real, unrepeatable. The floor where she had stood broken and smiling with the shadows answering her, and the world falling apart around her. And now this. Him. Here. Everything changed. Yes, she said. The bond ignited. There was no other word for it. It did not reform gradually. It did not knit itself back together the way wounds heal slowly, imperfectly, always leaving a seam. It arrived like fire finding air, like a door blown open, like the moon herself had been holding it, waiting, keeping it exactly as she had made it on the first night she drew the line between them, and had simply been waiting for the moment both of them stopped getting in the way. It swept through Mara from the inside out warmth and recognition, and the specific quality of belonging that she had felt the ghost of her whole life without ever being able to touch. The bond scar was gone, not healed over, gone, replaced by something living, something running all the way to the root, something that knew him and knew her and had always known both. Corvain rose. She felt the bond reach him and watched his face. When it did, watched the controlled surface disappear completely, watched something vast and real move through his expression, without any attempt to manage it, without the practiced composure, without anything between the feeling and the face. He looked at her the way the shadows had always looked at her, like recognition, like coming home. The howl started somewhere in the middle of the pack. One voice, then 3, then a dozen, then the entire hall. 500 wolves giving sound to the thing the pack bond was carrying between them, the wave of it building and rising and filling the great stone hall to its vaulted ceiling with the oldest celebration the moon's children knew how to make. The hall that had held her breaking held her whole. The pack that had come to watch her fall howled for her instead. She stood in the center of it, in the cold light that was no longer cold, with Corvain's hand in hers and the bond burning between them like the first real fire she had ever been allowed to stand next to, and she smiled. Not the smile of the rejection night, not the dangerous, quiet thing that had risen from the shadows when she had nothing left to lose. This was different. This was a smile that knew exactly what it had, and was not afraid to know it, that had paid the full price of getting here every kitchen silence, every turned back, every night in the servants' quarter, with her packed bundle, and her mother's carved bone and the steady interior discipline of a woman who had decided she would survive, whatever came, and was standing in the full inheritance of all that survival, in the place it had been quietly aimed at all along. The shadows were warm around her, warmest they had ever been. The moon, who had known from the beginning what nobody else could see, said nothing. She had said everything she needed to say. She had said it the night she drew the line between a bastard girl with forbidden power and a cursed king who was going to reject her in front of the world. And she had simply waited, patient as deep water, for both of them to stop arguing with what she had written. Outside the great hall, the northern territories were green again. New growth, thin and real, and full of the particular stubborn brightness of things that had survived winter and were making no apologies for it. Some things, when they come back stronger than they were before. The moon had always known that too. Thank you for listening to another emotional, magical shifter romance here on Moonbound Romance Tales. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, so you never miss more powerful, heart-gripping romance stories.